So you've got this problem where we've had this ideology of left liberalism that has essentially become extreme. And it's become extreme in institutions, particularly universities, but then it's spilled off campus and it's in the media. Now you had the New York Times giving, you had a Pulitzer Prize, a top award to someone called Nikole Hannah-Jones, who had this theory that the U.S. was founded in 1619 because that's when the first slave arrived, and that the American Revolution was all about trying to keep slavery and all these things which are simply not true by any objective historical standard. But no one wanted to question it because it was a black woman, and you have to always empower black people. And so it led to, essentially a lot of the excesses. So if you want to understand, I'd say if you want to understand Trump's election victory, part of it is a response to what were perceived as the excesses of the Black Lives Matter movement following the killing of George Floyd. And again, George Floyd was an extremely rare case, one of only maybe 10 to 15 unarmed black people that were killed by the police. And yet a lot of people believe that thousands of such people were, and even Joe Biden said, it's dangerous for a young black man to walk around outside because he might get shot. I mean, the level of moral panic around this, the result of that was the defund the police movement. Police withdrew from dangerous areas, and as a result, you had this explosion of crime, and the number of black people being killed just skyrocketed.
In this episode, I get to speak with Professor Eric Kaufman. Professor Kaufman is a leading expert in the fields of political demography, nationalism, and the intersection between culture and politics. Professor Kaufman also happened to be my professor when I was studying for a master's in Birkbeck College, University of London. It was a great time because Birkbeck College is a lovely place to study. It's a part of University of London, but it's an evening or flexible college. That meant that a lot of people studying with me were working during the day and often in very interesting roles. Some of my peers included journalists from Al Jazeera, some people from the Air Force who were just about to go into Iraq. So it was really interesting. It made for a really interesting environment, conducive for studying international relations and geopolitics. So I do hope you find this conversation of interest. Please do not forget to subscribe and like and share the video. It really helps. Thank you, and let's get started. Eric, hello, how are you?
Good, Tafim. Thanks for having me this morning.
Thank you. It's really an honor, and I've kind of, if you remember, I was your student in 2010, 2009 in Birkbeck College. So yeah. So it's really good to catch up with you. It's actually really daunting as well. So take it easy on me, please.
It's good to see you doing so well and maintaining an interest. That's great.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Eric, before we start, I wanted to ask you, I think was it 2018, you published a book called White Shift?
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that kind of, some of the questions that I had for you today kind of revolve around that subject area.
Right. And of course, it almost feels a bit like Groundhog Day because people were trying to explain the election of Trump and Brexit. And, obviously this morning we find out Trump's just won again.
Yes.
The issue really is in that book is speaking to that question to say, how do we explain the rise of national populism in Western countries? And the main explanation I give has to do with immigration and ethnic shifts leading to sort of anxiety within a chunk of the ethnic majority populations. That's the main drive. That's kind of like a major driver if we want to understand the rise of populist parties in the West, not right-wing populist, national populist parties. It's against that backdrop of demographic change and ethnic change. Now, there are some other wrinkles. So, one of the things we see, again, looking at today, is a very significant Hispanic vote for Trump. So minorities are also voting for right-wing populists. And that's one of the ways I explain that is Minorities are attached to the national identity, and the national identity kind of embodies a whole bunch of characteristics, not just the official constitution, but also ethnic, linguistic, religious, popular culture characteristics. And if those are seen as changing or in some way under threat, then minorities will also, some minorities, a significant number of them will also be responsive to that. So that's just in terms of, that was much of the book, was going through a lot of that data, survey data, very detailed. It's got, 200,000 words and hundreds of graphs in it.
Yeah.
But then the second part of the book really, okay, so we talked about what's happening now, why it's happening. The second part of the book is more speculative, looking ahead at processes of assimilation and talking about the emergence of what I see as these mixed race majority groups, which are more or less going to kind of emerge, and they're going to see themselves, cloak themselves in the mantle of the old white majority group. So it's sort of going to be a continuation of the white majority through this more mixed, blurred kind of majority. That's sort of the way I project it. And there's a whole bunch of different methods I used, including demographic projections, looking at research on assimilation, on the identities of mixed race people, all these sorts of things, as well as looking across history. So, yeah, that was really the book White Shift. And,
Yeah.
I could do a new edition now because we've had a second. What's happened is you had the initial populist wave, 2014, peaking, 2016, 17, continuing to some degree in Spain, Italy, a little bit. Then having with the pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, attention was drawn away and it went down a little bit. And then since the pandemic, it's kind of roared back, partly because of a spike in immigration in a whole bunch of countries, from Canada to Britain to the US to Australia. So this is really the context for what we're seeing.
Excellent. It is 6th November today. We woke up to the news that, as you say, Donald Trump is US president again. Were you expecting that? Were you following the elections, and were you predicting a Trump victory, or is it a surprise for you?
I was, and I can say the same about the Brexit vote and the 2016 Trump vote. I didn't predict any of them, but I just sort of, I don't have a whole lot of special insight when it comes to these very finely balanced polls, because when it gets down to that last several percentage points, it's down to very difficult to predict things. I mean, you could say that it looks like the polling firms were systematically missing people, because that's now 1 in 250 people answers a poll. So, you can wait for education, you can wait for race, you can wait for age, you can do all those sorts of things. But if there's any unexamined characteristic that's not being weighted for, that is influencing who answers a poll, then your polls are going to be out. And so it looks like the polls were out by several points, as much as 5 points. We'll have to see when the final vote is tallied, but it looks like there's a significant polling error in this election. So yeah, did I predict it? No.
Yeah. Also, Eric, so are you suggesting that populist leadership is one of the main driving factors is immigration?
In the West?
In the West.
In the West, that is almost the only issue. I mean, almost everything else pales into insignificance, I would say. Now, if we're talking about other places like Argentina or Mexico or Turkey or,
even in Pakistan, we had
India.
Imran Khan, if you remember.
Yeah. I mean, there will be other issues. It could be religion. It could be they're sick of the establishment because they're corrupt. So there is populism. Latin America has a long history of populism because it's been very badly governed, and so it's quite natural for people to get frustrated with the established elite. But in the West, there is also a history of populism in the West, which I can go into. And there's a lot of similarities, but there were different. I mean, the immigration issue was a major reason for a number of populist waves in the past. The US in the 1840s and 50s, Scotland between the First and Second World Wars, there was a Protestant anti-Catholic populism. So it looks very similar to past waves, but it's just the scale is different now.
Yeah. Okay. I'm really interested in immigration. I want to talk more about that. But before we get there, I also wanted to just touch upon like demographic changes, decline in production, like reproduction. How do you see there's a lot of countries with very low what do you call it? There's a
fertility rate, total fertility rate.
That's total fertility rate, TFR. So there's a lot of countries with very low TFR. I'm thinking even like South Korea, but in Europe we've got Italy. Actually, a lot of almost all the European countries, I think, are below the 2.1% that you need to kind of maintain a population. So how do you see that? And also, so first of all, how do you see that? How do you see that affecting societies in West?
God, that's such a good question, a huge one that I've written on. In there's a book called Political Demography, which you may remember, obviously. But so, yeah, I mean, you're going to get population aging. So the number of children required to reproduce the population is 2.1, 2 children per woman, plus 0.1 for accidents. So that's 2.1. Now, all developed countries, with the exception of Israel, and I'm struggling to think of any other exception, maybe Malaysia, if we're going to call that developed country, but there's very few that are above replacement level. And some of them are really far below replacement level, particularly in East Asia, like Korea would be an example. Coastal China would be another. Hong Kong. These sorts of places have below 1 or around 1, so incredibly low birth rates. What that means is you get a couple of things. One is the total fertility rate has been below 2.1 for over 40 years in many Western European countries, which means that the absolute level of population is starting to decline, were it not for immigration. So what you're getting is the decline. The second thing you get is population aging, because you had a large baby boom after the war. That's now gone up through the age, like a pig in the python's gone to the edge, and they're now, retired, and they're going to need medical care, and someone's going to have to pay for that medical care, and it's a smaller number of working people below. So the old age dependency ratio rises. What that does is it increases the amount of GDP spent on hospitals, old age care, pensions, and reduces the number of workers paying that, which means you then have a higher government spending. And so we're seeing the share of GDP accounted for by government and by medical care rising across all developed countries. That slows down economic growth. So we're seeing slower economic growth. So there's all kinds of knock-on effects economically. Politically, well, it then raises the question of, businesses looking for workers, particularly at low cost, so they're going to clamor for more immigration. Similarly with care sector, public, the health service. So we're getting a politics of immigration where you have lobbying from business and to some degree public sector interests alongside the charity sector lobbying for higher immigration. And so the aging is in some ways fueling this demand for labor, which transforms the ethnic composition of the population, leading to populism, basically. Because there's a significant chunk of the population in Western or in any country that doesn't want to see these rapid changes. What I would say is that you have a choice. You can do what East Asia does, which is actually have either rotating foreign workers, but the foreign-born share of the population is much lower. They are mechanizing. They are maybe rural. Some rural areas are depopulating. They've chosen to shrink rather than diversify. The other extreme is Australia, North America. They've chosen to try to continue the same population growth, so they are rapidly diversifying. Europe is somewhere in the middle. This is all causing tensions because some voters like diversity and change, other voters don't. The ones who don't are voting increasingly for the populist right, and the ones who don't are a larger group than the ones who do. So that's a very, very quick back of the envelope sketch of the impact of this.
Yeah. And what about the causes? Do you see any common, like, is there a common thread going through them in terms of the cause? Even countries like not just in Europe, but Korea, Japan, even Turkey, as you say, all developed countries. So is it just the case that because as you develop jobs, careers, those things come into place, or is there something else behind it?
Yeah, I mean, what you see is this decline. There is some cultural stuff behind. I mean, it's very tricky. So understanding fertility decline is a whole science. And across the street from us at Birkbeck was the London School of Hygiene that has one of the demography programs. I attended a course on projections over there. But well, what do we know? I guess there's a couple of things. One is, yes, economic development, which means that women's education, economic development, urbanization, all of those things contribute to the demographic transition, which takes us from high birth rates and high death rates to low birth rates and low death rates. Of course, as most of your children survive, you don't have to worry about having extra. When we move to the cities, we don't need many kids to work the land. With government social security, or pensions, we don't need children to provide for us in old age. So some of the material reasons for having kids are falling away. Of course, the other thing too is people, particularly women, are living. They want to. Maybe they want professional careers. Maybe they want to focus on consumption of material goods. Maybe they are busier. For all those reasons, it just seems like having a family gets pushed back later and later. I think the average age of first birth for a woman now is around 30 in Western countries. And they have fewer. And so that's kind of the basic outlines. But there are some different wrinkles to this story. I mean, one is we can see there are some cultural differences. East Asia has the lowest birth rates, followed by Southern Europe, followed by the German-speaking Europe and Eastern Europe. The English-speaking world is a little bit above that, and then the Scandinavian world has a little bit higher birth rates than that, with France and the Scandinavian world. And but we're talking about a difference between, the Scandinavians and France are maybe between 1.5 and 2. Southern Europe is between 1 and 1.5, so maybe 1.3 and 1.5. These are differences. They are important differences. So there are some cultural gaps, but the most important cultural difference is within a country between people who are religious and attend worship regularly, who have replacement, so 2.1 roughly fertility rates. That is, people who attend regularly Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, who attend regularly in an Abrahamic faith, will have a replacement birth rate. And then finally, people who are members of what I would call world-denying fundamentalist sects, Amish, ultra-Orthodox Jews, Laestadian Lutherans in Finland. Those groups have very high birth rates. And they reject the modern world in many ways, which allows them to keep having higher birth rates. So culture, and particularly religion, really matters. I wrote a book in 2010 called Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth?
I remember, I have a copy in my bookshelf.
Yeah. And in a way, that book is more relevant now than it was when people were saying it was too early in a way. But everything that's in there has only gone on steroids. And so, the secular birth rates have fallen and fallen and fallen. And they're so low now, you won't believe how low they are. I mean, it's kind of falling below 1.
Yeah, in South Korea, is it 0.9 now or something even lower?
It's like 0.8 or 0.7.
Yeah, that's scary, isn't it?
Insane. Yeah.
So looking at South Korea, I mean, some of the things that the government's doing to try and reverse the trend, things like giving more better working conditions, housing, I think even building a whole brand new city, things like that. Is that actually going to help? Is there evidence that these things help? Having people more holidays and a change in lifestyle?
I mean, it's very difficult. I think there are some small So small success. One of the debates is always whether these policies increase the birth rate for a short while, and then once people get used to them, they lose their effect. And it seems like they will boost the birth rate by a few points. Cash incentives. Russia seemed to get its birth rate up a little bit, but keeping it up is difficult. I think if you keep coming up with new gimmicks and new programs and announcements, then you can probably inflate it. I think by having a rolling program of these new incentives, you can increase it by a few tenths of a percent. So I mean, it's not nothing, but I don't think anyone's found a way really that's sustainable on a policy front, because this isn't necessarily material. One reason that East Asia and Southern Europe are the laggards in fertility is because you can imagine like a curve of patriarchy between very patriarchal society like Afghanistan or something over here, very high birth rates, a very feminist egalitarian society like the Scandinavian countries with moderate birth rates that are below replacement but not too far below. And then you have the semi-patriarchal, which is the worst for birth rates, where women have rights and freedoms, but there's still an expectation that when they get married, they won't work and they'll more or less serve the husband. Not totally, but to some degree that's the case. In Japan, iron his shirts for work the next day, that kind of thing. So it's not very appealing to a lot of women. So in those semi-patriarchal societies, they seem to have the lowest birth rates. Then there's a couple of other factors. The English-speaking world, although the English-speaking world's birth rates have really come down. The US is like 1.67 or something, Britain 1.55, Canada 1.3 or something. So it's really come down. But one of the arguments made was because it was easy to exit and enter the labor force. As a woman, you can work for a few years, leave, come back. You can also, if you divorce, you can remarry, have kids again. You can divorce. So there's that individualistic fluidity apparently was supposed to be behind some of the higher birth rates. Again, it's a small effect. It's part of it. I don't know whether it's the whole story or not. So there are all these little differences, but I think the biggest one is really around religiosity.
Yeah. Also, so I think it was 2009, there was a video that came out, it went viral. It was a small video, about 7 minutes long, talking about Muslim immigration issues and how it's going to impact the West. And I remember you kind of wrote an article to kind of debunk some of the points that I was raising, and we can talk about that later. But one of the things that video I saw before this podcast, I just had a look. It's still up there. It's got about 14 million views. But one of the things that they were talking about is that there's a point beyond which no culture has ever been able to reverse the trend or to survive. Is that the case? Is there a threshold beyond which there's no return?
It depends what you mean by culture. I mean, if you mean as a certain amount of ethnic change and then it'll tip over and become something else. I mean, we can see in history where that's been the case. Clearly, Turkey, when it was under the Greeks, it then became Turkish and Muslim, and then it's no longer Greek. So, or England was under the Celts, it became colonized by Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians, and they became the dominant culture. So, but then in other cases, like Sicily has had Normans and Arabs and all kinds of people invading it. And they've all kind of melted away and melted into whatever the Sicilians are. So it just depends. Hungary is another case where they assimilated and melted a whole bunch of different groups, Slavs and Jews and all kinds of people. So it just depends. It depends on who the groups are. I mean, one of the points about Europe and Islam, it depends on a couple of things. I mean, one is you have a bunch of different ethnic groups coming in, Bangladeshis and Pakistanis. If we just take those two groups, there's almost no intermarriage between those two groups. And, you have Kurds and Turks, you have all these different groups. and it's not obvious that they have enough in common to. But even if, but the other part of this, of course, is that the immigration into a lot of countries from outside Europe involves a bunch of different religious groups, Hindus, East Asian, African Christians, and Muslims from different areas. So it's what we would call super diverse, and it's not clear what that means. So it's not like it's one group coming in. The U.S. was a little bit more like that because the Hispanics were, although there are a bunch of different subgroups within the Hispanic group, at least you could say that's the bulk, that's the biggest group that's immigrating. They're territorially somewhat concentrated. So that's, if they kept growing, you could imagine that the U.S. could become a Hispanic country. I think in the case of Islam, however, because you've got many different ethnic groups and also you've got many different other religious groups coming, it's too splintered a picture to lead to. Now, of course, if those groups then become almost everybody, then yes, Britain would become Muslim. Assuming there were no Hindu or African Christians coming in, then yeah. But as long as you have a mix, I don't think it's likely. And I was suggesting, some of the projections were suggesting a maximum share of like 20-25%, even in the highest immigrant receiving countries for Islam, for those reasons. And the other thing, of course, is, to look at birth rates. Muslim birth rates have certainly gone down a lot. It's interesting. It depends which part of the world we're talking about, but certainly North Africa, parts of the Arab states, some of the Gulf Arab states. Although having said that, I still don't think the Muslim birth rates will fall as much as the Hindu birth rates are falling. So I think there could still be a fertility difference in, say, India, which could become consequential, but I wouldn't, I guess it depends. I don't think that Muslim birth rate is going to be that much higher. But the main point in my book really wasn't so much Muslim versus Christian versus Hindu or any other religion. It was much more within Christianity, within Islam, between fundamentalists and seculars. That's really the big gap.
Let me just take a moment's break to introduce our sponsors for today. This episode is proudly being sponsored by the Worldwide Listings Company Limited, or WLC for short. WLC is a e-commerce marketing agency specializing in making brands successful on Amazon. So if you are thinking of starting a new venture, or if you already have a brand and you want to take it to that next level, then get in touch and WLC will be able to help. For transparency purposes, let me also tell you that WLC is actually a company that I founded and am the director of. When you get in touch with WLC, you'll be getting in touch with me and my team, and we look forward to greeting you and seeing how we can help. Thank you, and now let's get back to the episode. Also, so if we look at, a country like China with a huge population and something like Singapore, and if they both have a TFR of about 1.3%, will that affect them the same, or does it get worse if you're a smaller country or a bigger country?
Well, because Singapore is wealthy, it can always just take in Chinese immigrants and assimilate them. And it has been quite successful in doing that. I suspect that what they do is they just maintain their ethnic mix by taking in Indians and Chinese in a similar 2-to-1 mixture, roughly speaking. And that allows them, so even though their birth rates are really low, I mean, the TFR for both Indian and Chinese in Singapore is 1 child per woman. So they have way below replacement. But they're able to, because China and India are big sources of population and they're relatively poor compared to Singapore, I think Singapore can do immigration with fewer problems, whereas I think in Western countries there are no sort of poor European origin countries. I mean, there was a few East European places, but those have either largely been tapped out in terms of their immigrants, or their GDP per capita has increased to the point where they're no longer sending people. So the problem that West faces is it doesn't have any ready sources of co-ethnics to immigrate to their countries. So
That's what I was going to say. So in Europe, if what we're saying is that the only actual solution to these problems, you can do tax breaks and you can do all cash incentives and stuff, but if at the point where we are, if the actual main solution is immigration, then for Europe, it seems like the immigration is going to come from mostly Muslim countries like Africa or Asia or parts of the world where I don't know, even from India, there's going to be a lot of Muslims coming over. So for Europe as a whole, is there any difference in the way that they're handling these situations? Because if you look at Europe as a whole, I think the TFR there is actually about 1.8% or maybe even lower. I'm not sure.
lower, yeah, probably 1.5, I would think.
Wow. So is there any difference in the way that they're trying to resolve these problems
Well,
within Europe?
I just think that, really what populism is about is people saying we want to be more like Japan, we want to slow it down. And so I think that what that means is we're going to shrink population rather than diversify to maintain population. That's all it means. I think people want to go towards shrinking more until, really the whole point is you're going to shrink until you get your native birth rate back up again. Now, how that happens, no one knows. There's different theories. One is over time through an evolutionary process. People who like to have children genetically, or people who are religious and therefore like to have children, will become a larger share of the population, and the populations will become more religious again. And the people who prefer or like having larger families will become a larger share of the population, and then the birth rate will go back up again. That would be a kind of one possibility, right? That's the argument now. Or you just continue shrinking. Clearly, at some point, a country will have to consider, now you have immigration as well, but there's this issue of assimilation. If you're the majority group, you can assimilate immigrants, but I'm not talking about integrating into the labor market or just having people vote or speak the language. Assimilation requires intermarriage, it requires identity change, something much deeper. That tends to happen organically. No government policy really seems to be able to move that needle. And so it's not obvious. You just have to wait for time to take its toll. And the problem, however, is if the assimilation doesn't appear to be moving fast enough. One argument is that you need to slow the immigration down until the assimilation catches up, and then you can always increase immigration again. So, you look at the US, for example, at least amongst the European groups, and now increasingly the Hispanics or some Hispanics, there is a melting pot, and people assimilate and have more in common than they are different, and more or less become part of this loose thing called the white majority. Now, if you were to go back to 1920, the Protestants, especially the Anglo-Protestants, who are the historic majority of the United States, were declining down to 50%. And that's why they restricted immigration. For 40 years, the immigration was very restricted. But over time, there was assimilation, which then led to the barrier between Protestants, Catholics, and Jews becoming less important, and there's more intermarriage and more melting. And so you then had the emergence of this new thing called a white majority instead of a WASP or white Protestant majority. Now, that process could occur in Europe. You could imagine enough intermarriage. So France, for example, there's a lot of intermarriage between North Africans and ethnic French. So there you can see the descendants of those mixed unions probably, but again, it depends, but probably are going to become ethnic French. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. And again, the question is going to be how quickly the assimilation occurs versus how quick the rate of immigration and diversity is happening, and the balance between those two. And if there's too much immigration and diversity, then you're going to get backlash and populism and all this sort of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's really the thing to watch. And then we don't know about birth rates. I mean, it may be that everybody on this planet in 1,000 years is going to be an Amish or an ultra-Orthodox Jew. I have no idea. I mean, that's certainly the way it's looking. But
Well, so earlier this year in the UK, we had unrest, we had riots that actually got triggered by unfortunate incident where someone went and killed some really young girls in a kind of a music club or something, and there was false rumors coming out that the person was an immigrant and was a Muslim, and all of those were not true. But nevertheless, it kicked off a series of protests and riots. So I was actually thinking at that time, I wish I could speak to Eric about some of these things, because I can see, obviously, it is from a point of view of people living in this country, when they look back just a couple of decades ago, how quickly the country's changing. I was listening to someone from the USA talking about how he went to Paris 15 years ago, and he's recently been to Paris, and it's completely changed. It looks like a North African country, which isn't a bad thing in itself, but it just doesn't look like Paris anymore. So those kind of things, I can see how that is going to cause anxieties for people. But on the other hand, you do need immigration to maintain your standards of living, or whatever it may be, to run your factories and to run your hospitals. So how do you balance those two things out? And what do you see? Is there an inevitable kind of a clash coming up?
well, I think it's the question of whether you need immigration is not, there's another dimension to this, which we haven't talked about, which is the sort of deep polarization within, let's call it the white majority population, between what I would call the cultural left or cultural liberals, and between people who are more attached to nation, ethnic group, so on, within the white group, more what you might call national conservatives. And the cultural left liberals are very dominant in media and academia, in sections of government, sections of the corporate world. So they have a lot of power, and their voice has been louder in terms of keeping immigration flowing. And that's regardless of whether the Tories are in power or Labour's in power. And I think there's a backlash that is also an anti-elite, anti this cultural left liberal elite, right? So that's a big component of this backlash. And so we have competing interests. And I think that this what you might call culturally conservative majority of the white population, or at least 50%, they want, basically what they want is Japan. So I think the argument there is, look, we can have less immigration. We're going to have to mechanize. We're going to have to use robots. We're going to have to cut. Maybe we're not going to have Deliveroo. Maybe we're not going to have 24-hour, hand car washes. A lot of things. We may not get those same services, but we can do without that. We can tighten our belts. We can pay more for these things. We just want to have a period where we have very low immigration, and let's just see if we can, get by with mechanization and changing our behaviors the way they are in East Asia, for example. And that's being resisted by either the cultural left liberals or the sort of more libertarian right, who kind of want free markets and free movement, frictionless movement of people, so that they can have large profits and earn a lot of money and whatever. So you have the sort of big business lobby alongside the cultural left, who've been very dominant in a lot of policy areas, particularly immigration policy. And that's now running into populist resistance. So, you're right. When you say you need immigration, it's not clear, right? Because obviously most immigrants coming now most of the world outside of Europe actually, except for Africa, has below replacement fertility. And so the immigrants are coming in. They are not going to necessarily have many kids. They're going to get old. They're going to need medical care. So all you're doing is delaying. And what will happen if the immigration flow gets cut off and you've been bringing in immigrants, they're getting older, suddenly they're now saying, okay, where's my pension? Where's my medical? You no longer have a supply of immigrants. So it's almost like a house of cards. It'll just collapse. So it's not a sustainable solution to the aging problem. And a lot of a lot of commentators who are left liberal have been sort of pretending that it is a solution when it's only a short-term band-aid. And really what the only solution is either to increase fertility rates or to adapt and mechanize, make sure you get all your, old people. There have to be incentives for them to work, even if they work part-time. If they retire at age 55, and they are healthy for another 30 years, a lot of them want to work. Maybe they don't want to work as intensely, but we have to find a way to include them in the labor market. So there's all kinds of things that can be done. Medically, we have to prevent people from getting sick. We've got to do better on prevention, more efficient. We might have to bring in charges for going to the doctor, £10 even, something that will just make you think twice before just going to the doctor for anything. Different ways. Maybe certain industries, like maybe you can't grow strawberries in Britain anymore. It just might be something that has to be done in another country where labor is cheaper. Okay. We've already, there are many things that China and, other parts of the world do a lot of our manufacturing because that's too expensive to do because of the labor costs. Well, maybe there are going to have to be more things like that just we can't keep propping up the agriculture industry and it has to go. Or different types of agriculture that are less labor intensive. So that's what I mean is I think populations would like to see a less labor intensive economy. Try it out. If they don't like it, if things cost too much and they want cheaper Deliveroo, they can go back to saying, okay, we'll have more immigration, but they haven't been given that choice. I think that's really where the discontent is.
Okay, interesting. The video that I was talking about from 2009, one of the things it was talking about was the low birth rate in Europe, most Western countries, and the very high birth rates in some African Muslim countries, I think Niger and things like that. And they were saying how immigration from these Muslim countries are going to change Europe and make it a Muslim country. And at that time, I remember, I think one of the points that you were talking about, which is something that you've touched upon now as well, is that even if you have immigrants coming from Muslim countries to Europe, the evidence is that as they enter the European culture and society, their birth rates decline as well. So they kind of assimilate to the local country community in that regard. So their birth rate isn't necessarily going to remain as high as it was back home. Is that right?
That is right. It's also the case that now if you look at the Muslim world and you go country by country, a lot of them have now, like Turkey, Algeria, there's a lot of places that have a below replacement fertility. And I think some of the Gulf Arab states, I'm trying to remember, Indonesia is probably at around replacement. Malaysia might be around replacement. So I think they've fallen a lot. Iran, for example, is always, for a long time has had below replacement. Although it's pretty stable at around 1.8, as far as I recall. So it hasn't dropped and continued to drop, which is interesting, actually. It'd be interesting to know why. But anyway, Turkey has continued to drop. So, yeah, I think they are going to fall into the same pattern. And so they're going to need medical care when they get old. So this idea that this is some kind of permanent solution to the aging problem.
Yeah, because I'm thinking also, just listening to what you're saying, is that so over the past, at least, 10, 15 years of data that I looked at a little bit, so we have had growth in immigration, but we've also had a continued decline in population. So in some ways, we're kind of getting the worst of both worlds.
Well, the population in Britain is rising. No, it's rising substantially.
Okay.
But I'm just saying, without immigration, it would be stagnating and eventually declining. Britain has historically had relatively high birth rates compared to other European countries. I think they were at the replacement level as recently as like 10 years ago. if I'm not mistaken, or around 10 or 20 years ago. So it's declined later in Britain than it did in, say, Italy or Germany, or some of the other continental European countries had an earlier decline. Britain and Ireland were relatively late. The United States was still at replacement level in around 2010, I think. But things have changed, and it seems like in the last 10 years, and with the pandemic, a lot of countries in the world have really seen a drop. And I'd say the historically high fertility zone, Scandinavia and the English-speaking world, has really probably had a significant drop in the last 10 years. And there are concerns it'll drop even more because of Gen Z and how they are growing up very slowly. They have certain cultural attitudes which are maybe a bit more feminist. There are a whole bunch of reasons why that we might expect in these sort of liberal Anglosphere or Scandinavian countries that there may be a continued decline in birth rates. And there, so yeah, I mean, that's really the story, I suppose, for Britain. But the point is, the population is still increasing rapidly, and is going to increase by many millions, or several millions anyway. I don't know the exact number, another 5 million or 6 million to be added in the next 10 years. So immigration-driven population increase is definitely a reality in Britain.
Okay. And also, so are we saying that as these problems persist, and on looking at the course that we seem to be on, trying to solve these problems with immigration and things, populism, populist governments, politics is going to be on an increase, and it's going to cause rifts within societies, and even like things like woke culture, identity, these are going to be the main issues for the foreseeable future, do you think?
Yeah, so I haven't talked as much about what's going on in culture and ideology, which I think I need to bring in here, because essentially what woke is making sacred historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That process really can be dated back to the 1960s, this post-civil rights era, when African Americans, the civil rights movement really captured the imagination of everybody, but particularly those on the left, not just the radical left, but also the liberal left, which I think is, in my new book, Taboo, I talk a lot about that liberal left as important, the kind of let's be kind and compassionate to the weak, that left, which is very different from the Marxist left, who said, no, these people who want to be compassionate, they're delaying the revolution, they're terrible. But both strands of the left really have embraced these identity markers and seen radical social transformation, or transformation coming from identity groups. Now, what you can see is that the liberal left is really why immigration became more liberal in Western countries. The US, Canada, Australia all liberalized their immigration laws in the mid-1960s as a result of liberal pressure, left liberal pressure. That left liberalism then opens up immigration to particularly non-traditional sources outside Europe. But then that left liberalism, which is what led to this opening up, that left liberalism as an idea then kind of became radicalized. It's almost like a strain like COVID, a strain of what is a normal flu every year, it happens, and then suddenly you get this strain. And that's kind of what woke is. Woke is sort of, you have these ideas around, we want pursuing equality is a good thing between men and women, between black and white, gay rights, that sort of. And then you also have this idea of, we have to be kind. We don't want to say nasty things, racist words, but also we don't want to make life a hostile environment at work for minorities. We don't want that. So we're going to watch what we say and speak. But of course, once you start saying, I'm not going to say something, even if it's true, like if I believe somebody is a man, not a woman, and I don't say that, or there can be, and there are a number of other examples. If I don't believe that there are any Indigenous children buried by these residential schools in Canada, which there aren't, you have to, that once you start hiding the truth in order to make somebody not feel bad, you're into a process whereby you're saying that sensitivity matters more than truth and free speech. So this is the origin of a lot of the battles that we've seen in universities, around the NHS, around all of these things, and then also the teaching of history. So the emphasis upon, this idea of these particular sacred minority groups as essentially being victims of history, and being victimized by the white settler colonial occupier, whatever, genocide, whatever. It's this very sort of black and white morality play that's been created in a very romantic view of indigenous people. I mean, actually, there was in Mexico, obviously the Aztecs had human sacrifice on a large scale. You had slavery going on amongst the indigenous. You had genocides, Comanche. None of that stuff is ever taught. So you have a very sort of slanted view of history. And so you've got this problem where we've had this ideology of left liberalism that has essentially become extreme. And it's become extreme in institutions, particularly universities, but then it's spilled off campus and it's in the media. Now you had the New York Times giving, you had a Pulitzer Prize, a top award to someone called Nicole Hannah-Jones, who had this theory that the U.S. was founded in 1619 because that's when the first slave arrived, and that the American Revolution was all about trying to keep slavery and all these things which are simply not true by any objective historical standard. But no one wanted to question it because it was a black woman, and you have to always empower black people and whatever. So we led to, essentially a lot of the excesses. So if you want to understand, I'd say if you want to understand Trump's election victory, part of it is a response to what were perceived as the excesses of the Black Lives Matter movement following the killing of George Floyd. And again, George Floyd was an extremely rare case, one of only maybe 10 to 15 unarmed black people that were killed by the police. And yet a lot of people believe that thousands of such people were, and even Joe Biden said, it's dangerous for a young black man to walk around outside because he might get shot. I mean, the level of moral panic around this, the result of that was the defund the police movement. Police withdrew from dangerous areas, and as a result, you had this explosion of crime, and the number of black people being killed just skyrocketed. And so all of this stuff then has come to be associated with the politics of the Democratic Party in the US, and I think that's damaged them in many ways. Even the fact that arguably Kamala Harris is not a particularly strong candidate and was picked mainly as a vice president on what are known as diversity and equity grounds. So wanting a black woman and then not wanting to replace a black woman candidate for the presidency with another candidate. I mean, so a lot of these kinds of sensitivities and sacredness around race arguably prevented the Democratic Party from having a competition, selecting the best candidate, and having somebody that could win. So all of these things matter, So I think when we're talking about immigration, we need to understand that part of the reason that the U.S. say couldn't control its border in the last 4 years is because they felt it would be racist to deport people. It would be somehow look bad for a predominantly white country to be preventing predominantly non-white people from coming in. And all of these sorts of symbolic considerations are behind the problems at the border, which is arguably one of the main reasons also that Trump wins.
Because in the US, Republicans also claim that the Democrats want to bring in more immigrants because it increases their vote bank, and it changes the balance of power between the two sides. Also, I'm thinking some of the things that you mentioned is making things worse and worse in the sense that both sides seem to be going more to an extreme, to the point where they don't necessarily think that we have a disagreement. They actually loathe the other side. They call them non-patriotic and traitors. And I know these problems occur in a lot of places, like in Iran, you have problems between religious and seculars. In Turkey, you have similar problems. But in Western countries, it just all the different the schisms are just wider, but also more diverse. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to remember, the interesting thing about the U.S. is that it's actually not very divided by race. I mean, in a way, it's becoming less divided by race. If you look at this election, one of the stories that's going to emerge is Hispanic and also Black voters have moved to the right. And at one time, people thought you were going to get the Republicans supported by white people and the Democrats supported by non-white people. So you'd have an old-fashioned style ethnic conflict, but it's not like that, actually. So what you actually have is this big schism within the white group between progressives and conservatives. And so what is that about, though? At heart, these schisms, this polarization, is really about one group of people who are psychologically wired to think of change as loss. So if there's a ethnic composition change in my country or my community, I see that as a loss because I'm attached to the way things have been in the past, versus a change is exciting and new and interesting, right? Now, the number of people who say it's interesting and exciting is a much smaller group. But they are also much more likely to be highly educated, probably more likely to be well off, certainly more likely to be involved in universities and cultural institutions and to have cultural power. But that's really so immigration itself and the ethnic diversity, that in itself is not what's driving this. If what we mean is ethnic minorities against whites, that's not the main thing. The main thing is two groups of whites, one who likes diversity and change, one who doesn't like diversity and change. The more diversity and change you have, the more it drives a wedge between these two groups. That wedge is based largely on psychology, and it's a third to a half genetic. Whether you like diversity and change, there have been experiments with dots on a screen. Do you like them in patterns that are orderly, or do you like them more random? And that predicts actually your politics to some degree. So I mean, a lot of this is, I think, deeply rooted psychological reactions to change in society, and that's what's splitting populations. As societies get more diverse, as they change, you're getting this splitting occurring. I think that's the main thing. Now, there are other things going on. So, for example, if you talk about what's happened to sexual orientation and gender identity, that is to some degree the extension. Again, all of these things begin in the 60s largely, but the logic of them has been taken to the next level, the next level, the next level. So first it was gay should have rights. Then it would be gay should have the right to get married. Then it was, well, we're not gay anymore, we're queer. Oh no, then we also have trans people who and by the way, young people can transition when they're 13, 14 and become a boy instead of a girl. Yeah. So you have actually radicalism has been going up to a higher and higher level on a lot of these fronts. And I think that's really adding to the divisions. It's layering onto. So we have a pre-existing divide, which is based on some people like diversity and change, others don't. On top of that, we then get a moral conflict. You have the people who say diversity and change is great, we must celebrate it. How can you not like it? You're a racist, you're deplorable. The people who are accused of being racist and deplorable say you're woke, you're political correct, whatever. And then you have this second level, a moral value conflict layered upon that different reaction to difference and change. And so there's just deepening the conflict. And that's kind of where we are. I do think to understand this, you have to understand what's happened to the left, this shift to identity, the radicalism of, what I would call humanitarian extremism around identity, which is what we call woke. That is also something that's been building since the 60s in waves and has simply reached a point where it is now deeply enmeshed and it's driving polarization in many sectors of society. So that's a separate development, in some ways separate from, we can imagine that even if there was no immigration, even if France was 100% white, you would, I still think, have this issue. I mean, if Canada was 100% white, you still have the indigenous issue, the attempt to rewrite history. All of that would be going on. So I think these are somewhat separate processes. The ideological extremism has its own independent roots. The demographic change, okay, to some degree, the rise of left liberalism opened the doors of Western countries to immigration. But I still think the diversity coming out of immigration is to some degree a separate dynamic. It's partly a separate dynamic from the ideological extremism coming out of left liberalism.
How do you see cancel culture, and do you, with the election of Trump, supported by Elon Musk and things, do you think that's likely to change in the USA, but also then in the West as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, cancel culture, we have good data on the number of professors fired, the number of speakers no platformed. It sort of starts rising in the early 2010s. It peaks around 2020, 2021, goes down a little bit. Now, of course, we've got the whole Middle East, Israel thing, which led to another spike in no platformings. I don't think that's going to last. I think that's just, I think we can bracket that out. But I think that the general trend was, a rise to a peak. And then, now what is behind this? What's behind it is, again, that evolution of the liberal left. The liberal left essentially became increasingly attached to the view that historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups are sacred in a way, and therefore anything that you say that might be offensive to the most sensitive member of one of these groups, if you say something like anyone can make it in America if they work hard enough, somebody could say, well, that's offensive to Black people because there's systemic racism, and it doesn't matter how hard they work, they can't make it the same way somebody else can. So that's a microaggression, and we're going to call that a form of racism, and we're going to say that's maintaining, white supremacy, whatever. That's just an example of the kind of extremism that underlies this, that once you make certain groups sacred, you then change a lot of debates from shades of gray to black and white. And so there's a black and white, there's a right and a wrong, it's moral absolutism. If you cross the line, you are profaning the sacred. You are insulting the gods, and therefore you must be cast out of the community through cancellation. And that's really where this moral absolutism is coming from, that underlies cancel culture, is that people are saying, no, you're not just wrong, you're evil. You are violating my sacred values. And so there's a question that's asked, people who disagree with me politically are immoral. Do you agree with this statement or not? Young white progressive Americans, it's almost half that agree with that statement. This is very much related to their agreement with another question, which says white Republicans are racist. If you agree with that statement, then you are more likely to have a very absolutist view of morality, because you have this idea of, we have a sacred group, let's just say, which are racial minorities, and anything which has a hint of insulting or offending such groups is therefore racist and is therefore violating one of the sacred precepts. And if you violate that, you're out. It's just black or white. You're either in or out. If you violated it, you're gone, and you're evil. Because this is so important. Whereas if we were to take another category like light-skinned blacks versus dark-skinned blacks. Now, we know there are differences in terms of their income and whatever, but that doesn't actually matter. No one cares about the politics of skin color within the black community. And every black student at Harvard could be super light skinned, and that wouldn't bother anybody, because it's not politically salient the way the big category of black versus white is. So these have been politicized and sacralized, and that's what underlies the intolerance, the growing intolerance of the left culturally, and which underlies cancel culture.
Eric, is there also a link between identity politics, change in demography, and global conflicts. How does it affect conflicts, and how does conflicts then in turn affect identity and demography? I'm thinking
Yeah,
about
it's
at
so
the
big,
moment
right?
Ukraine, Israel, Middle East.
So, boy, very complicated. So, cancel culture and the culture wars. Basically, if we take woke for a minute, it's not as though um, critical race and gender ideology in schools or free speech is what decided this election for voters, but the downstream effects of woke, the fact that woke meant the Democrats didn't want to control the border. Woke meant the Democrats went all in on Black Lives Matter and defund the police, which led to a crime wave. Woke to some degree means you're going to tolerate homeless encampments and open air drug use in the cities. It means you don't want to enforce discipline in a classroom in case more Black pupils are disciplined than non-Black pupils. So the downstream effects of woke leads to a whole bunch of problems which voters do care about and vote on: crime, immigration, education, whatever. Now, foreign policy. Okay, well, what about foreign policy? That's an area that is, it's implicated. I don't think it's as obviously connected to downstream effects of woke. So, for example, US foreign policy towards Israel, towards the Middle East, is not directly shaped, I think, by woke. Now, that doesn't mean that on campuses that woke isn't playing a role. So woke, for example, has a settler colonial view of the world, this idea that the US is built on stolen land, Canada is built on stolen land, and therefore they are illegitimate. And they take that racial lens of oppressor versus oppressed, whether that be white settlement of indigenous land or whether that be white domination of Black people through white supremacy. That oppressor oppressed settler indigenous view of the world is then sort of copied and pasted into the Middle East, and with Jews in the role of the white settlers, Palestinians in the role of the people of color, indigenous. And so for leftists on campus and for a significant number of young students, for example, they will tend to see that conflict in settler colonial terms, which comes out of this sort of settler colonialism is kind of a version of critical race theory. It's a sort of, I guess you could say it's an offshoot of critical race theory. It's part of this generally woke worldview. So 70% of young Americans say, the native peoples of America lived in peace and harmony before the Europeans arrived. The reality is actually quite the opposite, but we won't go there. But the point is, there is this quite binary romantic view of the colonizer colonized, which is the ideology, and that ideology is affecting the view of a considerable number of young left-wing people of the Middle East. Now, of course, it's a very complicated web in the Middle East, and certainly I'm not going to sit here and defend the settlement policy of the Israeli government at all. What I would say, however, is that those tensions, however, are playing out more within American or Western societies. I don't think they're affecting foreign policy yet. I don't see the effect because the Democrats still have maintained, their traditional approach to that conflict in the Middle East. I don't think they've changed anything radical. So no, I don't think it's affected foreign policy in that sense in any serious way. I'm sure there are things I'm missing here, but I think it's still a quite separate area. Now, maybe in 20 years, that'll be different. But right now, I don't think it's had much effect directly, no.
Sure. Just looking purely in terms of demography, how do you see the future of Ukraine given there's been so many people leaving the country because of the conflict, obviously so many deaths and destruction. do you see that having like a long-term impact on society in Ukraine, or do you think once things are settled, then a lot of those people who have left the country will come back?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that some of them will come back, but I think a lot of them will remain in the West. And, one possible reason is that I think there is probably going to be some hostility between the people who stayed and the people who left. And maybe a big question is how much suspicion and hostility there will be between the Ukrainians who stayed and the ones who left. I know people in London who, yeah, I mean, they're staying in London, they're Ukrainian. I mean, if he's a young man, he knows he's going to be sent to the front line. So there's clearly, that's self-interest, and that's going to rub up against people who fought. And so that's not going to be a pretty sight unless after whatever settlement comes out, that the Ukrainians who are there make a conscious effort to try and put those differences behind them. But I think some will go back. I mean, so that's one thing. I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens now that Trump is going to be president in January. What is going to happen there? I suspect it might accelerate progress towards drawing some line in the sand. Whether that's going to be upsetting to Ukrainians, anyway, I just don't know. I mean, it's going to be an interesting one to watch. But I think that clearly both Ukraine and Russia have low birth rates. There's been out migration, but I think Ukraine will probably manage even with a somewhat smaller population.
Yeah. Eric, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your thoughts. Straight after this session, I'm going to go on Amazon and order your most recent book on wokeism. Before you go, would you mind telling us about some of your other publications, and then maybe send me links that I can add to the notes?
Thank you, Tafim. It's been a pleasure, and I'm glad to see a student doing so well. I mean, I will, I'll send you all of those links. I've got my my Twitter feed. I've got my website. I have a 15-week course, open online course on woke, which is open to anybody. So I'll send you those links, and hopefully somebody will come along. And good luck with the show.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All the best. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.